Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It has just turned 7 o'clock, and it means that it's time to start our penultimate Science for the Community lecture of this autumn 2021 series. For those of you who've not joined us before, my name is Tom Miller. I have the honor and privilege of being the 6th director of the Chesapeake Biological Lab, and I welcome you to our Science for the Community lecture series. This has been a lecture series we've been putting on for the last decade, designed originally to bring the science that we do at the Chesapeake Biological Lab to the community of Southern Maryland, who have been so generous to us over the years. So generous, in fact, they built the first lab building for us back in 1925, and we continue to work to repay that debt. This seminar series has had many diverse presentations throughout the years. You can access many of them on the seminar series website and look at past presentations. And for this season, we decided to give the entire series the theme of climate change. And over the last 5 weeks, you've heard from various lecturers about the sort of the fundamental science underpinning climate change. You've heard about changes in dynamics to wildfires. You've heard about how climate change is affecting fisheries. And last week you heard about how climate change is infecting the Arctic marine ecosystem. In many of those presentations, you have heard discussion of the IPCC reports, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And those reports have been very, very influential in leading our thinking and in guiding our thinking on the potential range of impacts of climate change on the planet and the ecosystems, and indeed on society. Tonight's presentation is by Dr. Libby Jewett and is going to examine how the IPCC reports are produced. They go through extensive review, extensive documentation, and they will end up being approved by a conference of the parties, which you've heard COP26 coming up in Glasgow in a little under a week now. And that's all part of this IPCC process. This is not the last one in our autumn series. We have one more next week, which is Dr. Slava Lubčić, who's going to be looking at a slightly different aspect of climate change, who's going to be looking at how banks and other financial organizations adjust their risk based upon some of the uncertainties about future climate conditions. And so we hope to bring it into your checkbooks, so to speak, to help you understand how governments and, as I said, financial institutions are adjusting their risk. So returning to this evening, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Libby Jewett from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Libby is a graduate from the University of Maryland, getting her PhD with Dr. Ken Stevens, working on the effects of coastal hypoxia, as low oxygen conditions, another influence of climate change and human activity. Following that, she joined NOAA and in 2011 became the head of their coastal acidification program, yet another aspect of climate change. And Libby has led that program now for the last decade. We run these presentations as a Zoom conference, and so unfortunately you won't be able to actively engage in questions at the end, but we do encourage you to type questions in the chat box. I will moderate those questions at the end and ask as many questions as we have time for. With that, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Libby Jewett. Libby, over to you.
All right, I'm gonna get my screen up. And you can let me know once. So does that,
That's it.
we're seeing
Okay.
that?
Full screen, and we can hear you clearly as well.
Excellent. So thank you very much. It's a pleasure being back in the University of Maryland system to talk today about my work in assessments. And I will definitely mostly be covering my work with the IPCC, which has spanned the last 3 or 4 years. But I did want to say that the IPCC were not the first assessments that I have participated in. So as you may know, there are also now a series of our own US national climate assessments. And in fact, by law, the US through the Global Change Research Program is required to come out with a climate assessment every 3 or 4 years. And I think the early ones, I'm not even really sure how organized they were, but I had the opportunity to participate in the 3rd National Climate Assessment. And then most recently in the volumes 1 and 2 of the 4th National Climate Assessment. And in fact, I thought I was off the hook, and then got recruited at the last moment to be an author on the climate trends chapter of the 5th one, which is just starting up the process. So if anyone has questions about those assessments, they're actually, I have to say, getting more and more organized over time, but are actually organized in quite a similar way as the IPCC. So I had some understanding about how to work on assessments, and then was recruited into the IPCC. So just to give you a broader understanding of that relationship between the IPCC and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So Tom mentioned that, and how these two processes kind of go hand in hand. Interestingly, so the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which produces these assessments, actually existed before this thing that we called the Convention on Climate Change. And but the reports that come out of the IPCC obviously are very important to and influential to the Framework Convention, which meets every year and is the meeting of the governments coming together, which, as Thomas mentioned, is starting next week and will happen for 2 weeks. In that convention, decisions are made, global stock takes are taken of where we are on national contributions, and what progress are we making, and where are the worst impacts. And so it's not exactly the same process. The IPCC is actually the scientific information that then feeds into what is really a separate process, which is the convention, where the countries come together and make commitments on how they're going to or not going to affect and remediate and mitigate climate change. So the first assessment report came out, as you can see on the top. So FAR was the first assessment, came out in 1990. The second one in 95, the third one in 2001, and then they became separately named. So AR4, 5, and on to AR6, which is the one that I most recently worked on. Interspersed in there are actually a number of other reports that are requested through the IPCC scoping process, and I'll mention some more of those in a moment. So the role of the IPCC is to assess on a comprehensive, objective, open, and transparent basis the scientific, technical, and socioeconomic information relevant to understanding the scientific basis of risk of human-induced climate change, its potential impacts, and options for adaptation and mitigation. And these reports should be neutral with respect to policy. That is not policy prescriptive. And there's a lot of sort of confusion about that, but also the authors really work very hard to make sure that we're not providing policy prescriptive information in these reports, because the policy is going to be made through the convention, the meeting of the governments. So should be neutral with respect to policy, although they may need to deal objectively with scientific, technical, and socioeconomic factors relevant to the application of policies. And so all of our work goes back to the scientific literature. And so to the extent that the effects of policies or policies have been tested through scientific research, then we report on it, but we're not actually saying, therefore we need to do, X. So in this sixth assessment cycle, which is the one for which Working Group 1 report actually was released about a month and a half ago, there were scoped as part of the process also 3 special reports, and you probably remember them also coming out with quite a lot of press coverage. One was focused on, okay, what happens if we could keep warming at 1.5 degrees? What impacts are we going to get within that factor? Because there was a sense that we need to focus on 1.5 versus anything higher. Like, could we keep it at 1.5? We had also a special report on land and another one on ocean and cryosphere. There's a particular interest and a running theme through the AR assessments on cities, also requested by the governments as they were scoping the IPCC. And then we have the main reports, Working Group 1, 2, and 3, as well as a synthesis report. And so well, I'll tell you in a minute, but my contribution was Working Group 2. So these are again, the 3 special reports, which also had a very similar process to what we do for the main assessment, which is authors coming together, focus on particular chapters, and working through the assessment of the literature in order to come up with a relatively concise document for the public. So over the course of the existence of the IPCC so far, and again, the AR6 is just on the verge of being released, there have been 5 full assessment reports, 12 special reports, 9 guidelines for national greenhouse gas inventories, which I actually don't know as much about, and 6 technical papers. Of the 12 special reports, there's actually, as part of the process that led up to AR5, there actually was a special scoping group, and the publication of a special report on ocean acidification, which, as Thomas mentioned, is my area of interest for my work. Okay, so how does this report process work? So as I said, the governments come together in a special process where the scoping of the report happens. I did not participate in that particular scoping, although it's an opportunity to think about what has happened since the last assessment, what are the particular areas of emphasis that might be considered for the next report, and probably all sorts of other kinds of conversations about the other other special reports that are going to be written, that sort of thing. And so then the panel approves the outline. That's again panel that's I believe composed of representatives of the governments. Yeah, I believe that's how that works. And then once the outline is approved, and you really do have to follow that outline when we actually do the full-on assessment, then comes the nomination of the authors, and that is an open call to the community, to scientists, to program managers, to kind of the world, to say, are you interested in actually being an author? And you have to provide your background and affiliation and evidence, maybe your CV, I think, and evidence that you have written papers, that sort of thing. And then the like in the case of the US, so the US requests within the US those authors, and then that information comes back in through the US Global Change, I think it's GCRP, reviews those and decides which ones are the ones that they're going to put forward to the more official selection of authors that happens at the IPCC level. So that's just the first part of the process. So now we've had the selection of the authors. You're contacted by the IPCC. You have signed all sorts of conflict of interest things, and then the beginning of the process starts. So that whole thing has probably taken about 6 months. So the first order draft, that's the first draft that you produce as a group of authors. We actually had a lead author meeting, which I wasn't able to attend because the US government was in shutdown. But if I'd been able to attend, I would have been in South Africa. All the authors came together. That's where kind of we got to know each other, both each other and authors from the other chapters. And we started putting the information together for what we thought would be the first order draft. So that, and I'll go into more details about that process through subsequent slides, but basically there's, first order draft, that draft then gets reviewed by, it's sort of an informal review. I think it was maybe by all of the other authors on the IPCC. So just kind of first round input. Then we had to create a second order draft, which actually went through full government review. And then the last is the final draft, which goes through another, no, that doesn't go through the government review, but the summary for policymakers goes through a government review and a government approval process for dissemination. So, right. So then this is sort of, there's the group. So this is the first on the plenary is talking about how the governments and the bureaus meet to approve this summary for policymakers. So each of the reports, the working group 1 and 2 and 3, each of them has a summary for policymakers because they're each composed of many, many chapters. And instead of having a literally word for word approval of the entire report, which might never get done because they're so long, there's the creation of the summary for policymakers. And then the governments actually meet together in a formal several day overnight process of actually vetting every statement in the summary of policymakers, and then then it's finalized, and that goes out along with, usually the rest of the report kind of comes out a little bit later as it's getting finalized and figures are fixed and everything. that's released, lots of back and forth with the broader community to share the report and the findings. And frequently these will also obviously be highlighted in many ways in the UN Framework Convention, as Thomas had talked about. So this is just to say the work, each of the working groups had its own approved outline, and the working group 1 outline, which is not the one that I was working in, is working primarily focused on the physics and the chemistry of the effects of climate change on the Earth. And so, they have chapters like global carbon and other biogeochemical cycles, short-lived climate forces. They do have an ocean, cryosphere, and sea level change, although I actually don't think that was in some of the earlier assessments. There's been a real big push in the last assessment, maybe in assessment 4, and definitely in the current one, to really bring the ocean in a very robust way. So that's very near and dear to my heart. As a working group 2 author, we were also given the opportunity to review the working group 1 chapters. And this was really important because a lot of the information that is showing up in working group 1, like the specific climate scenarios that are being run, or the more sort of further afield effects that or impacts that they include in there, we want to make sure that we're picking up the right language and scenarios and in the working group 2, so that it kind of flows, which of course is really hard because working group 1 is working and they're changing things, and then we have to make sure it gets translated when we're doing working group 2. So it's a really iterative process, but really, really hard to do. But I appreciate how much work has gone in on constructing a process that is super robust and super inclusive. So I'll just say that. So working group 2 outline. So this was my particular part of the report that I was working on. So we had chapter 1, point of departure. Then we had a section 1 that is basically the chapters that are focused on broader sectors. So we had terrestrial freshwater ecosystems, oceans and coasts, water, food and fiber, cities and settlements. And I think maybe that chapter wasn't in the original one, or in kind of the earlier reports. Health, well-being, and the changing structure of communities, poverty, livelihoods, and sustainable development. And so then section 2 are the regions, and this is where my actual chapter is. And so Asia, Australasia, Central and South America, Europe, North America, small islands. And then we had another section on sustainable development pathways, kind of focus on adaptation and pulling in information from across the other sections into kind of broader statements about, managing risk and what are the key risks across sectors. And so in chapter 14, we also had to, and I'll just go back, we were requested to structure our chapter to include information about each of these sectors also. So there's all this sort of, making things parallel. So general structure of the reports and the IPCC kind of in general is that there's, you have quite a lot of support from full-time people working in the Bureau who are, trying to kind of keep track of where everyone is on their drafts and technical support for how you choose whether you can use a certain gray literature or not. And I mean, they're just always like tons of questions about the process. They also help to organize the author meetings, of which we only had 2 in the end, or I only went to 2, but because of COVID, we ended up not being able to have the last one in person. So we had working group 1 is the physical science, working group 2 is the impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. One thing I didn't mention before is that I actually can't, because our working group 2 report has not been released yet. We finished, but it's actually likely going to be the summary for policymakers will be approved in February. Our report will be coming out at some point after February. So we can't start talking about the information, although we are encouraged to talk about it once the report comes out. So we had working group 1, working group 2, working group 3 focused on approaches to mitigation of climate change. And then we have this greenhouse gas inventory. In terms of the author team, and I just want to give you a little bit of an explanation of that. So the author team for the North America chapter, we had so basically covering Canada down to Mexico was the technical delineation of North America. We had coordinating lead authors. Every chapter has coordinating lead authors who really have to put in a fair amount more time than the authors to make sure that they're coordinating back with the Bureau, coordinating with the working groups, coordinating with other the chapters. So it actually is a pretty big job. And we had 1 author from Canada, 1 from the US, and 1 from Mexico who are coordinating lead authors. Then we had the lead author team, again, a group of mostly academics, a few of us from NOAA, although we're academics too. And we had, a team from Canada, a team from the US, and a couple of people from Mexico as well. Then we have this whole other category called contributing authors. And that's a process where so we're working on the report and we're realizing that we really need to cover some particular topic. And we don't feel like we have the expertise within our group, nor do we have the sort of time and energy to devote to becoming an expert in that topic. And so we have the opportunity to reach out to other potential authors and invite them to be contributing authors, but they actually have to be approved at the working group 2 level. So it's not just like bring in anyone you want. It's more that you have to actually vet people, and then they can come and actually help, provide content for parts of the report. And they are given, they're listed on the report when it finally comes out. So they're given credit for that. In addition, there's a whole nother group of people. This was 2 women in our case who are nominated, again, through a similar process, as I noted before, to be review editors. And their whole job is to make sure that the author team is adequately addressing comments that come in through the official review processes that happen. And so, any, like when it goes to government review, actually goes to public review, we will get, after that process, a spreadsheet with, 800 comments from all different walks of life. And we have to go line by line and say exactly how we addressed every comment and provide, and then the review editors make sure that we've done that well enough, sufficiently enough. And that information then goes back to the IPCC Bureau. And I don't know if it actually becomes public or not, but it just makes sure, that we're all doing our due diligence and not just sort of dismissing things because we don't want to deal with them. We also had a chapter scientist, and this is someone who actually isn't writing the report, but is helping us to make it happen because there's just so many logistics involved. So that's a nice opportunity, especially for might be early career scientists, to get involved in this process and not have the onus of actually writing the report, but still being able to watch the whole thing happen. And then, of course, we have expert reviewers. So every time one of the first order draft, the second order draft of the report happened and would go out for review, there would actually be a stable of people who had signed up to be expert reviewers who would be sent that report, and they would provide their input. So there's quite a lot of steps and opportunities to really make sure that what you're writing is reflects the science that exists. So using the report, so you get the whole report done. It's important from a scientific point of view. It's important from a policy point of view. As we said, it very influential for how the Conference of the Parties understands climate science and understands what adaptation means and understands what opportunities for mitigation might exist. It's very important for outreach. We've seen with Working Group 1, there were many media events that were happening around that. It's an opportunity to get information out about what's changed in the last 5 years since the last report, and where how important, how urgent it is that we be taking action, both within our own countries and then globally. And as I said, quite a lot of media, and that's good. We want to be getting that word out. So this is just kind of lining up the various assessment reports and decisions that were happening through the various the framework convention meetings. And so, like, for instance, AR5 came out basically right before COP21, which was the big France one where the important decisions were made about commitments from countries to keep us on a sustainable path. So that's exciting, and I think the writers of AR5 are probably feeling very proud of the information that they put together. I will say that the Working Group 1 findings will be relevant and hopefully well highlighted within the COP26, which is the one that's just coming up. And I actually have the opportunity to go to the COP. I'm not a negotiator for the US, but I'm involved in a number of side events. So anytime one of these Conference of the Parties happen, there's sort of the central negotiation that's happening, but then all around that, in various venues around Glasgow, which is where this will be happening, will be all sorts of side events, which are intended to educate the negotiators about particular topics that they might have that are, of interest to them and that are also relevant for the negotiations that are happening. So that's exciting. And I'll report back on how that goes. So I would encourage you to get involved. I know that one of the things I'll tell you in a minute is that it's a long process. It definitely is a long process, but you feel really proud that you've been a part of something that is hopefully leading towards change in on our planet. This is just to highlight the the numbers of authors from different regions. And I will say that a focus on diversity, on ensuring that there are many women, that there are people of color, from many different countries involved, has been a growing focus of the IPCC. And in fact, at the first of the lead author meetings that I attended, which was in Nepal, we even had a diversity training, where we separated into small groups and kind of thought about who we were and where we came from, and how sometimes it's hard for certain people to like speak up in big groups, and we need to value each other's expertise and voice in the process. So that was really exciting to see that focus. Other ways to get involved, contributing to the existing literature. Sounds like if you've been listening, that the seminars that are coming out of CBL this fall have been very focused on climate change, and it's really important. It says here, look out for the various cutoff dates for the literature. We had very specific cutoff dates. Of course, I can't remember what they were. That's the kind of thing we left our climate scientists in charge of. It's like, can we include this or not? But after a certain date, then that whatever came after that, you could not pull into the report. So definitely keep tabs on that. But of course, it would pull it into the next assessment. It's not like you lose it. But so definitely, keep writing your papers. Really important. And to the extent that you can peg them to, if you're doing predictions, to the kind of scenarios that you're seeing in the IPCC, that just makes it easier for the authors to pull that information into the report. I definitely encourage you to go and try to be an author. I think it's been an incredible experience, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. And then, of course, expert reviewers. We definitely need people to review the reports, and they're big reports. So you almost, you sign up to be a reviewer and you probably don't have enough time. So maybe, I know in my case, I end up just sort of zeroing in on a couple of parts of the reports that I actually have expertise on, but I would love to, have the opportunity to review the whole report if I'd had time. This was just a photo of the lead author meeting that we had in Nepal. I'm in there in the red circle. It was, this is a lot of people, and it's probably not even all the authors that participated in working group 2. So this is just working group 2. So now, this may more or less be my last slide. I just wanted to go through some of the opportunities that I consider important to think about in the IPCC process, or any assessment process, and then some of the challenges that came up while we were working through the report. So, of course, being part of a huge collective scientific effort which has an important impact on global decision making. I think I've made that clear, and the fact that you were hearing about the IPCC and the other webinar presentations that have happened this fall means it is super important, and the process is hard and painstaking and careful, and rolled up in ways that we think and hope are going to be impactful for decision-making processes in countries. You have the opportunity to make new connections with people, which might lead to other academic papers. So we had a great author team. We had a number of really interesting social scientists, which isn't a kind of a group that I normally am interacting with, and just learned so much from them. And I definitely have at least 1 or 2 papers that we're probably going to spin off of the IPCC, kind of things that we presented on in there, but we want to expand. And I'll go into that in a minute. really important, again, going back to the first bullet, the opportunity to make a compelling case for how climate change is affecting your country. In my case, I was on the North American chapter, and affecting your country for your country. So making that case for your region or even for the planet about how climate change is, how it's happening, how fast it's happening, and the impact it's having. You can learn about new topics for which you may not be an expert. I actually ended up doing some special sections on impact of climate change on commerce, which none of us were experts on the author team. We pulled in a few other people to help us. Well, that's not true. There were other people on the team who could speak to this, but we realized how little information there is for impact on commerce and sort of the different pieces of the economy. I mean, I feel like that scientific evidence is growing, but anyway, it was an opportunity for me to learn more about that. And you get to travel. Well, when we could travel, we were able to travel. The first author meeting was in South Africa. As I said, I wasn't able to attend because the US government was in shutdown. But I was participating virtually a little bit, so I could at least keep tabs and meet the people a little bit. Then the first meeting where I met everyone was in Nepal. And then we had another meeting in Portugal about a year and a half after that. And then the last one was supposed to be this past November. I think it was supposed to be November of 2020 in Guatemala. And of course, because of COVID, it couldn't happen. They pushed it off. No, maybe it happened in virtually. And so we were able to do some of it, but it was not at all the robust interaction that you can have when you're together. So challenges. With inclusive decision-making comes lots of process. And so, I would say that's a good thing, but it's also just a lot of energy put into, kind of assessing this just within our author team, but even more broadly, as you're kind of interacting with other author teams, personalities come to play. You need to make decisions about how you're going to move forward, but it's, if you don't have leadership that's kind of helping you make those decisions, it just takes a really long time. So I'll just say you have to be ready to not just like force your way into like, this is the way it's going to be, because chances are, you're working with a lot of other scientists who have strong feelings about the content. And so you just have to work through that and kind of get to a point where you all agree on the information. It was a little definitely challenging on how each of the regional chapters is going to be structured. We kind of got one bit of information at the very beginning of the process, that I can't even remember exactly what that was, but I remember it wasn't until Portugal, which is now 3 lead author meetings in, at least 2 versions of the report were out, where they said, we really want this kind of flow of information from impacts to adaptation to solutions. And we had it kind of structured that way, but we had to then actually go back and restructure it and restructure the executive summary. So that was that kind of thing where, the leads of IPCC were, and I'm sure it was all good intentions, just trying to create, a more unified story flow across each of the chapters. It's good for them to give us that direction, but it's always hard when you've like structured it another way and then you have to restructure it. But we got through it. Lots and lots and lots of meetings. We had a few of these lead author meetings, but other than that, we were actually meeting almost every week for about an hour just to talk about different parts of the report and who, updates and new things we had to add, things we'd noticed that we hadn't included before. There was always so much information to share. So, and this is just, again, one chapter. So you can imagine that's happening for all the chapters. The whole process is quite long, which actually is good because it feels like it would be, part of you is thinking, oh, it'd be great if we could just get this over with. But on the other hand, it's going to be more robust. You're going to always be like finding and including new literature as the time progresses. And it gives you an opportunity to like cross-check with the other parts of the working group report that you're on, and then the other working groups, and making sure that the scenarios all worked. I mean, there's always a crush at the very end, but the process is actually quite long and for a reason. You have to make sure that you are assessing rather than doing a literature review. That's also a very intense process. You have to give confidence levels to almost all of the statement, well, at least the kind of high level statements in the review or in the assessment, and it's called an assessment for a reason. So that's kind of a hard struggle actually, but you have to use your scientific expertise and be able to assign those confidence levels. And of course there's back and forth review, so you get input on whether you've made that right assessment. You have to make sure that the statements that you're writing are traceable to literature. So you need to have a whole tracking mechanism for that, which is super important. You have to stay on top of the literature, of course. Concise is hard. Like, these reports are probably 20 times longer if the scientists were allowed to put everything in that they wanted to put in. And in the end, you came down to like, you're given 40 pages for the whole chapter, get it in there. And the first time you wrote it, I think it was more like twice that. So, you keep just getting more and more concise, which is good because people aren't going to read something that's giant. But it's hard because you're going to have to make choices about what you include and what you don't include. Again, working across working groups, I've talked about that a number of times. And then finally, making sure that you're leaving readers, assuming you feel that there's a sense of urgency, that is being conveyed through the information that you've included. And also, in our case, in this report, in this assessment, we definitely were focusing on adaptation as well. So what are countries and regions and states doing to respond to climate change? And there's quite a lot. There's quite a lot of information about that, and quite a lot of actions happening. And so that was actually a positive side of having gone through this process. Is, you just realize how hard actually already we're trying to adapt to climate change, and how much of that is actually, are we going to be exceeded by climate change itself? Are we going to hit hard limits on how much adaptation we can actually do? So, and then COVID, of course, hit in the middle of our process. That pushed out, thankfully, actually pushed out the release dates, super hard. Many of the authors had young children. They, were trying to balance that with actually working on the report. So luckily there were those delays baked in as we were all trying to coming to terms with COVID and how we were going to get the report done, even though COVID was happening. That's what I have to say. So that's the end.
Thank you, Libby. So we're going to begin with the questions, but I'm going to take moderator's privilege and ask the first one. You've concentrated on the IPCC and the Conference of the Parties that's coming up. Is there a formal process in which the IPCC results feed into your agency's work and think?
Oh, wow. Yeah, no, as far as I know, and there may be something that I'm not aware of, there is no formal process, at least for NOAA, to kind of take that information, hand off, and requirement to respond to it in some way. I will say that many NOAA scientists are involved in being on authors and being reviewers, and so we're like intimately involved in the actual crafting of the report. And I know that our leadership, especially in the current administration, is very very open to the message of the IPCC report, and will be showcasing it and referencing it in the upcoming COP for sure. Yeah.
Thank you. So Bill Raines, who's one of the people who regularly attends our seminars, without asking you to divulge details of Working Group 2, but you made the case that you were asked to push for solutions, right? The narrative had to include solutions. Were those solutions on the horizon that we could do this, or were you forced to think of solutions that could be implemented now?
Well, everything that we put in the report is documented in the literature. It has to be published in some way.
Okay.
So if something's being tested now, something's being used now in that solution space of adaptation, and it's been studied and shown to be effective or seen as a response, that information is in there and pretty well documented, I think. Thinking more into the future of, it's a harder space where, and I was kind of mentioning this before, but and this is in the literature as well, are there hard limits to that adaptation that exists? And that's definitely kind of in the literature to some extent also. Again, we were not going to be policy prescriptive and say, this is what we should do. It'd only be things that we are doing or have been presented in the literature, I guess, as possibilities. Although I'm not, those ideas aren't like flying into my head right now, but yeah.
So many of us who attend this webinar are lucky to live in a state that, almost independent of administration, has had a very strong position on climate change. Both Democratic and Republican governors in Maryland have really taken climate change and the need to act on board, in part because so much of Maryland is low-lying and is clearly going to be impacted. But I know one of the questions our staff get when they're out and about on outreach activities is a question about what individuals can do, right? And so is there a sense that individual action is important, or is individual action most important when it affects legislatures and executive branch at state and national level? Is that where individuals have their biggest impact, or do you think there are individual changes in behavior that people could make that will be helpful?
So I guess my comment there would not be wearing my IPCC hat. It might be more, yeah. I mean, I don't think there's an individual sort of section of the IPCC. It's much kind of more packed together than that. But I know from an ocean acidification point of view, because clearly that's also driven by carbon dioxide levels, we always try and end our presentations on a positive note, and say, yes, I mean, we are making individual decisions all the time about whether we're thinking about it in that context or not, but about whether we're emitting CO2 or not. And can be how transportation is like one of the biggest emitters of CO2. So clearly flying and driving and all of those decisions would obviously been affected by COVID. So maybe we'll see some positive impact there. Yeah, and decisions about food you eat. CO2 is emitted more in sort of intensive farming practices. So the less meat on the menu is generally a lower CO2 impact. So I think yes, we are, and we're driving things by our consume the things that we consume. And in fact, I just actually heard an interesting talk today about the speed of delivery of things to our door front, and how are we driving CO2 up because we want that thing tomorrow, versus being happy to, I don't know, get it some other way or not get it at all. So I do think that we as individuals have responsibility for that, but and if you can convince your neighbors, even better.
So sort of along those lines, you'd mentioned in several places in the talk about the pleasure of getting together as a scientific community. And one of the things we've lost in the pandemic is that pleasure of getting together as a scientific community. But going back to what you just said, it's also true that that does have a large carbon footprint. There were probably, in the photo that you showed, 150 people in Nepal. The short haul flights to Nepal are very few. They're all long haul journeys. So do you think, based upon the impacts and the studies that the IPCC is pulling together, that you will see less of that in the future, even when COVID effects are not sort of controlling everything that we do?
I mean, I think so. I mean, I would ask the question back to you. I mean, I think there's definitely something important about people getting together, especially people from all over the world who are in different time zones. One thing I've realized, that when you try and have these meetings with people in different time zones, it works, but it doesn't work because there's people having to wake up in the middle of the night, and then it's sort of the onus always ends up falling on particular time zones that they're up in the middle of the night. So but I think we've learned how to do conferences also remotely. So I think there is some responsibility to continue that. And, I don't know how long it'll continue before we backslide into wanting all to be together again. But I think there's going to be a mixture, right? Hybrid kinds of things, which may or may not work. So, I can't read the tea leaves on that, but I agree. I mean, yes, it seems crazy that we were.
As long as we don't do that before I've had the chance to go to Nepal, I'll be fine with that choice. With that, our hour has come to an end. Libby, I wish you a great trip to Glasgow. Be sure to have a pint of heavy, as they call it. And thank you very, very much for the work that you've done on behalf of the nation. And thank you very much for your presentation this evening. And we hope to see many of you back next week on Tuesday evening for Slava Lubček's on climate change and insurance risk. So Libby, once again, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.